Let's take a look at how we could start implementing the list editor, right? We have basically it's a list editor, right? It could be just a to-do list, right? We're adding items, we're removing items, we're editing items that just happen to represent widgets on a page, right? Instead of a to-do list, might be just a title, right? Who wrote the to-do list, and maybe some description, and maybe when it's due, right? So every domain model obviously is different. Here we're editing widgets, right? A list of widgets. So we might want to start with a stateless component that renders a widget. This might be a wrapper function, right? That can represent any widget. And then depending on the type of the widget, it might render as a heading widget, it might render as a list widget, it might render as a paragraph widget. So somehow there would be some logic here that depending on some type, right, it would render one way or another. We would render the widget, and here we start looking at some of the properties that we might pass the widget, perhaps a text. And that text might be interpreted in different ways, right? For the paragraph, the text might be the text inside of a paragraph. For a link widget, then the text might be interpreted as the text right inside of the hyperlink. Yes. So this text element might be interpreted in different ways depending on the type of the widget. And so here we have an example of just passing some widget component the value of the text, and then we might want to say, well, how do we render maybe a list of these things, right? So we already know how to render a list, right? We use the map function that can take an array of widgets, and as you iterate over that widget, you can then render several instances of that widget element, right? So here we're passing the widget object down to the widget component, and perhaps depending on the type, it might render one way or another. Here we have an example of passing an array of widgets. One that says the text is heading, the text is list, and through the property widgets, and the widget list might render through this as an array of widgets. Okay, so we might want to be able to modify this. Right? We already know this, right? We already know that we can pass arrays down to containers or components, and components can then iterate over them. We know that already. What we'd like to be able to do is add widgets, right? Add Redux to this whole mix, right? So how we might want to do that? So I think the simplest way to start this is to create a reducer that might start off with some default array of some widgets, right? That we can then feed into this widget list container. And this widget list container can then perhaps iterate over this and render it. So let's start with just trying to get that going, right? Just an array of items that are sent over into a container that can then iterate over it. All right. So let's start there. Let's see. Let's close this.